when I talk about story, I mean the type of story that would be okay to tell around a campfire. That is, it's a complete narrative. It's got a beginning,
Yes.
it's got a middle, it's got an end, it's got a character who has some goal, but that character meets obstacles that prevent them from achieving that goal. And they have to either transform themselves or transform the world to be able to get there.
Today, Dan Manning joins us on the pod. Dan spent a career in the Air Force where he was an A-10 fighter pilot, military diplomat, and speechwriter at the Pentagon. But now he's a master storyteller for his company, Build the Story. And Dan has built a business working with founders, coaches, consultants, and executives to help them tell their stories that their audiences need to hear. Now, we all know intuitively that stories are powerful vehicles for selling ideas and inspiring people to action. But most founders don't know what stories to tell or how to tell them. That's why I asked Dan to join us. He shares with us the 3 stories every founder needs in their toolbox. And he shows us how to build those stories for maximum impact. So get ready for a masterclass on entrepreneurial storytelling on episode 13 of the Systematic Selling Podcast. Dan, welcome to the pod.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Well, one of the things I wanted to bring up out of the gate for our audience is that both you and I went to Samford University, that is SAM, not Stanford, but Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama, at the same time and graduated the same year. But we did not know each other, even though we had some of the same classes, which is wild for being at such a small school at that time. I'm curious, went to school in Birmingham, but did you grow up in Birmingham?
I did actually. Yeah.
Did you really?
Yeah. So I lived just about and still live now about 30 35 minutes away from Sanford, and I grew up there and went to high school right there in Birmingham, and then after graduating Sanford, was in the Air Force and traveled all over the world. When I retired, became back, and I still drive by the campus sometimes just to take a look. It's a beautiful place.
It absolutely is. It brought me from South Florida to just a beautiful part of the country and a beautiful campus. Now, you came away from Sanford with a computer science major, and yet now a lot of the work that you do is, I guess you could consider more in the softer skills, leadership, communication, storytelling, and so forth. How do you think that discipline that you learned in computer science help shape what you're doing today?
So yeah, I think there's a couple ways. I was pretty good at computers at that time, and did stuff with computers in high school. And honestly, I needed a scholarship to be able to go to college. I needed somebody else to pay for it. So so in the Air Force, at the time you had to have a technical major to get a scholarship. So I majored in computer science. I also for a while I had a minor in history and then in business. So ultimately, the computer science degree was my ticket to have a degree, and then to be able to get a good paying job, and then to be able to do the things that I wanted to do, and to do some really interesting things throughout my life. If you look at the more direct connection, the way that I write stories isn't too different from programming a computer. Yeah, I mean, so you're absolutely like working with people, and there's intricacies and unique characteristics of people that you have to be aware of.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I build stories in a very programmatic way. I have a formula that I use, and I've written 450 stories in the past 2 years or so. So, and I've used that formula for every one of those. And if you build it into this formula and you give people the information they need to make meaning from what you're saying, then you're going to get some output. If you do it right, most of the time the output is what you want, and sometimes it's not. It's not always, but then you learn. You go back and you adjust how you're doing it. So there's probably a closer connection than you might expect at first glance.
So would you say it's the it's the structure that you've got to use in programming to create a particular result for the program to run properly that you would say also informs how a story can run properly when it's out in the world. Is that a connection that you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I don't, I haven't thought too much about it or got into it too closely, but
Yeah.
yes, yes. And that formula is based on the way that humans receive information and receive stories, right?
Yeah.
As the communicator, it is my responsibility to be easy to understand. And if there's work that has to be done somewhere. Either I make myself clear so I'm easy to understand, or
Yeah.
I'm not easy to understand and then count on my audience trying to sort through to figure out what I really meant. But if I can provide that information in a format that is clear, that is crisp, that is exactly how my audience expects, it's just easy for them to understand what I'm saying.
Absolutely. And I want to put a pin on this because we're going to circle back and break down your recommendations on good, solid structure for business stories. But before we do that, I want to unpack a little more of your story. And so you went to Sanford, you were ROTC, correct?
That's right.
With the Air Force.
Air Force, yep.
So you were planning to go into the Air Force, but you became a fighter pilot, and it was the A-10. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
What led you to become a fighter pilot? Why was that something that as a kid you're like, man, this is what I want to do, or did you kind of stumble into it? What led you?
Yeah. So growing up, my grandfather would take me to the airport, and he had two sons actually that were in the Air Force, and one of them was the backseater in fighters and F4s, and then eventually in F-15Es. And we would go to the airport and watch the airplanes land and stuff, and I had lots of airplane toys. But I didn't dream of being a pilot. Like, it was fun to do that sort of stuff. But then once I was in ROTC, I was pretty good at that, and my grades were good enough, and I had the opportunity to go fly. And it was almost like one of those things that if you have the opportunity, like, why would you say no? And I'm glad I did. So I went to pilot training right after graduating from Stanford.
Yeah.
And I stayed there for, pilot training was about a year, and then I stayed there for several years after that as an instructor, actually. So as a brand new pilot, I taught the next group of pilots how to fly. Yeah. And then at the end of that, I'd done pretty well there. The commander asked, like, what do you want to fly? He said, there were three of us up for an assignment. He said, we have an F-16, an F-15C, and an F-15E. I was like, I'd really like to have an A-10. It's like, all right. So we went and traded away the F-15C to some other commander, got an A-10, and then I became an A-10 pilot after that.
What is it about the A-10 that you really like that separated it from the other three?
So by far the mission. The mission of the A-10 is to protect our troops on the ground. Mm-hmm. And like everything that every person in the A-10 community does goes directly to that mission. So, if you are, no matter where you are, if you were in Afghanistan or in Syria or in any bad place, and there are bad people who are coming to get you, and A-10 shows up, and it's gonna change the day.
Yeah,
it is incredibly powerful, incredibly precise. It's a well-defended airplane, so you can get down low. And I would rather have people shooting at me than shooting at our troops on the ground, because I've got a pretty big gun and I can shoot back, and it gives them some space to do what they need. So 100%, it's the mission, and everyone involved in it, from the people who are maintaining the aircraft to loading the weapons to doing the weather to gathering the intel. Like, the one goal is keeping our troops safe on the ground.
Wow. So you're in a sense a diversion to your diversion and cover fire for the troops on the ground.
Absolutely. Yeah. The mission's called, close air support, and it's a diversion by fire, right? It's got the gun on the front is a Gatling gun, right? And the bullets that it shoots are about the size of like an old Coke bottle. In the first second you squeeze the trigger, it shoots 45 of those. In the second it shoots 60. So in 2 seconds, you have essentially, depending on what type of round, like 100 hand grenades that are in a space, and you can put it into the size of a decent sized bedroom from a mile away. Like it is incredibly precise, and it's diversion, but it's diversion by fire.
Have you flown in missions where you did take fire?
Yeah, and so I was deployed, for combat in Afghanistan,
Yeah.
and there were some sorties there where people were shooting back at us.
You tend it for the little bit that I know you, but I've also followed your content for 2-3 years now. You have this extremely calm demeanor, whether you're talking with me now or just when I see videos of you and so forth and the conversations that we've had. Is that shaped and formed in that crucible of being a combat fighter pilot? Because I gotta imagine you gotta be calm in those situations, nurse of steel.
Like I haven't talked very much about that either, but yes, and even before that, because remember my first job flying was teaching brand new students who it was they would have some type of like some private lessons, and maybe they would even get their private license in a small propeller plane. But this is the first time that they were flying a jet that it was just a small little like Volkswagen with wings, but it was fairly substantial, and you could do lots of stuff in it. And they have to learn to land, and they have to sort of learn how to do that job and how to become pilots. Most of them would be fighter pilots themselves. Yeah. And as an instructor, sitting I'm less than a foot away from my student, but my student has to learn to do it like for themselves. And eventually in that program, like I am there just to keep us safe, because they need them to make a mistake, right? To be able to make a mistake, to recognize their own mistake, and then to fix it. So I have to be calm enough to be watching, to sort of read like through their visor and through their mask and their helmet, like what are they thinking? How is this going to work? And give them as much room as they need to learn without stepping in. And then when I do step in, it's at the last moment. I don't need them to freak out though. I've got to, all right, let's not do that. Here we go. Let's do this. Here's how you do it. All right, back to you. You do it. And doing that for year after year, it's I think that helps to stay regulated, stay calm, and then work it out. Nothing good happens if you're panicking.
Absolutely. And I gotta imagine your kids were blessed to have you to teach them to drive, because I remember sitting there with my daughters driving, and I didn't have the same calm that you just described when you're.
So my son is 17. So he's now been driving for about a year. Yeah. And I did very much approach it like I was teaching somebody to fly, except I don't have any controls at the passenger side. Yeah. So I have to like move it back a little bit, further. But he would joke, at the end of our driving lesson, he would say, "Oh, I knew when you switched into your pilot voice and your instructor voice, like, all right, gotta pay attention because I'm doing something wrong." Yeah, good. You learn quick, son.
Absolutely. Now, you were Air Force pilot for what, 10 years?
Yeah, for about 10 years, about half of my career, maybe closer to 12 or so, but yeah.
Okay. And then you moved on from there, and you were working in the Pentagon, still with the Air Force, but as a speech writer. And walk me through what your career was like there, because that's a huge shift to go from the adrenaline of being a fighter pilot and an instructor to now, being at the Pentagon and doing some teaching, also, working closely with the leaders to capture their voice as a speechwriters. Walk us through what your experience was like there.
Sure. Well, in between that, that's when I became a military diplomat. So near the end of the time that I was flying the E13, I also got a master's degree in international relations, and I was doing a lot of international relations work. And really, that was the thing that I was most interested in before I went to college. But I couldn't get a scholarship for international relations, so I got it in computer science. But once I was able to choose the master's degree I wanted, I was able to pick something that I was interested in. Yeah. And you can only fly for so long. And that was during a time when I wasn't getting as many sorties as I felt like I needed to stay proficient. I was doing lots of like instrument and weather evaluations for other pilots, but not too much for myself. And I knew I didn't want to be an airline pilot after I left the Air Force.
Yeah.
So I applied to be it's called a defense attaché. So you essentially are a military representative to the U.S. Embassy in a foreign country. So I applied for that, and I applied for mostly like Eastern European, and I didn't get any of those. But the person at the assignment center said, well, you can go to Kyrgyzstan and be the senior defense official, or you can go to South Africa and be an assistant air attaché. So I talked to my wife. Her first question was, where's Kyrgyzstan? So we pulled out a map and did a little bit of map looking. It's in Central Asia. So, north of India, west of China. So I wanted, if I'm going to be somewhere, I prefer to be the person in charge, if that's an option. So, and I wanted to learn Russian as well. So we picked Kyrgyzstan. And then for that training, we spent a year in DC, actually about a year and a half learning Russian and then preparing for the job. And then 2 years in Kyrgyzstan, working out of the embassy before we went back to the Pentagon, doing some international affairs work, and then eventually being a speechwriter there.
Now, what type of work did you do in Kyrgyzstan?
So I was the senior defense official, defense attaché. So I was the Secretary of Defense's representative to that country.
Okay.
So I would, meet with people on a day-to-day basis to do diplomatic stuff, right? To talk to them, to understand what they're looking for and where our interests and needs, overlap. We had a base actually in the country at the time, the transit center where people were flying into and out of Afghanistan. We also had lots of cargo that was moving through Kyrgyzstan on the way to Afghanistan. So I was working those issues. And then when things would come up related to the Department of Defense, I would be responsible for those as well. Unfortunately, near the end, we did have a crash at one of our refueler aircraft there. So I was on that scene for a while. But essentially, like anything that had to do with the military relationship between the U.S. and Kyrgyzstan, that was what I was responsible for.
I kind of imagine that's a great laboratory to learn skills of influence, persuasion, and sales. What, from your perspective, how did that experience shape you? Is there a specific instance in mind where you were interacting with someone where you go, this skill will serve me, or you look back and you go, that experience there is what helped shape me who I am today? Was there something there that comes to mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that I think about, like I became a decent Russian speaker, especially near the end. I could convey my ideas, and I could have full conversations without an interpreter to be able to do that. But I didn't have a very wide vocabulary. So I knew the words that I knew, but I certainly wasn't as fluent in Russian as it was in English. But remember, in English, but at this point I had a master's degree. I had done some PhD work, so I could write at an academic level. But I didn't have access to those words, but I still needed to convey that idea. So I got, I think, better at simply conveying the thing that I want to convey. And also the people that I was working with, they understood that I wasn't, a native speaker. So, they would alter their language as well. But that idea that lots of times we get in our own way when we're communicating because we want to show that we're smart. We want to show that we can command big words to have some big meaning. But honestly, I think the real mark of intelligence is not having to use big words to convey big ideas, that you use the words that your audience knows, understands, the emotions that they already are familiar with, their own motivations, their own interests. And now I tailor what I'm saying to fit them so that I get the outcome that I want. After all, like I'm the one that's interested in having my message understood, not necessarily my audience. It's my responsibility to communicate to them in a way that they understand.
And wow, because it sounds like the fact that you realized that you were struggling with trying to find the right words and rushing to communicate, that was actually an advantage to you because you didn't have that curse of knowledge and you realized you had to be humble and empathetic and go, all right, let me see how I can figure it out based on the vocabulary that I've developed and what I need to maybe add to it. But this is the assortment of words that I have to use to get this message across. I imagine that forced you to begin thinking that way.
100%. And to be direct, right? Because I didn't have the words that would allow the nuance, right? So I had to be direct in what I was saying and how I was communicating, or I would be at risk being misunderstood. It's the same thing that I talk about in stories now, right? My storytelling style is, I say it's brutalist. It is clear, it is clean, and my goal is to be unmistakable in having you form the meaning. And it's the same thing that I was looking for, at the times that I was, speaking Russian as well.
So you went from being a defense attaché to then going back to DC, to the Pentagon, and became a speechwriter. What led to that aspect? So here you were, a computer science major, you've become a fighter pilot and, you become a military attaché, but what signaled going, hey, yeah, this guy could be a speechwriter here. Let's tap him.
So it was not nearly that visionary. So what happened was, so I get back from Kyrgyzstan. I was there for 2 years. I was doing like foreign military sales type of work, specifically around fighter training. So primarily I was working on the Iraqi F-16 program and the Afghan A-29 program, these small airplanes that it was a rare bright spot in that relationship.
Yeah.
And for part of that, I was deployed to Afghanistan to be an air advisor. So on the ground, working with Afghans, living on actually an Afghan base. We had U.S. security on our section, but we were living on an Afghan base there. And I was there for, I think, like 4 months.
Yeah.
Actually, maybe 5 months. I don't remember exactly. But when I get back, you get a little bit of time off work before you go back into your office. And I'm walking back into my office on the very first day I'm back after being deployed for several months. I literally have the box of my stuff in one of those old like paper boxes that you get reams of paper in. And I'm walking it back in to my desk. And my boss says, "Hey, Beef." And my call sign, he's like, "We just got a note saying that the term was, you're hot for a 365. That means that you are like soon to be deployed for a year to somewhere else."
Wow.
And I was like, dude, like I literally have the box of my stuff in my hands from the last one. It's like, well, sorry, that's the way it is. Because I didn't stay 6 months here. It didn't like trip some flag in the system, whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, I'm not going to do that. The same day, the advertisement came out looking for speechwriters to write for the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Secretary of the Air Force. And at that level, I'm like, I could do that. So I apply. Eventually I get selected. And then the assignment people, I said, well, look, I just got picked by the unders who I eventually started working for, the undersecretary to be her speechwriter. So they's like, well, you're still going to have to go on this deployment. It's like, all right, when your boss calls the undersecretary of the Air Force and says that the only human that can go on this deployment is the one person that just got picked to be the speechwriter who just came back from the deployment, then all right, I'll go. They never made the call.
Wow. So you got started at that point?
Yeah. So I became a speechwriter then. So I wrote for the undersecretary for a year. I did some work also for the vice chief of staff of the Air Force. I think I only wrote one thing maybe for the chief and one thing for the secretary, but we were involved in all of those, very, the highest level of the Air Force, discussions.
Yeah.
About policy and about, strategy, not military strategy so much, but the strategy of how you run a giant organization like that. But it was during that time that I realized that the PhD that I was working for, if I finished it, my plan was to stay in DC and work in think tanks and do sort of the same type of international affairs type work.
Yeah.
But by sitting in those senior meetings and watching the bureaucracy at the highest levels in action, like, this is not what I want to do. This is not how I want to spend the rest of my life. I want to do something different. I'm not sure what it is, but not that. So I stopped writing my PhD dissertation then, and then went on a different deployment and took a very different turn. And there you go.
So would you say that your experience as a speechwriter is what opened up your eyes to what you didn't want to do, because you were there, you were in the halls and could see what the future would look like if Dan Manning decided to stay on that path?
Oh, 100%. So I would tell new officers when they got to the Pentagon, because I would help to train them in the staff work and the stuff that we do there. Like, you can make a difference here, but it's going to require every day you trying to tell, to persuade, to convince people of something that you knew was common sense the first time you looked at it. But everything moves so slowly and people get so entrenched that you have to like chip away, even for like small changes, for a long, long time before things finally click and turn. And that was just not how I wanted to spend my life. Right. I mean, it's frustrating, and I think I could do more in some other place. And I had, by the time that I was leaving, the Air Force, I'd been in for 25 years, and I had given enough. My family had given enough. I wanted to do something else.
Yeah. What year did you leave the Air Force?
19.
Wow. So it has not been long at all.
No.
Yeah. Just before the pandemic. What? So you left the Air Force 2019. Did you go straight into entrepreneurship from there?
So I did. Both my wife and I knew that we wanted to start businesses doing something. I was going to do consulting. My wife has a fresh roasted coffee business.
Love it.
So we wanted to, move somewhere with a lower cost of living than Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And our families are still in Birmingham. We were able to buy some land and move back just outside of Birmingham where we could do that. And then I started, sort of my first focus was on teaching skills like applied creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, communication, working with companies, working with teams to do that. But also the pandemic happened right around that time, so it put a real damper on going out and doing that type of training.
Yeah.
But also, the business itself was not particularly successful because I didn't come to mind for people at the time that they needed me the most. Nobody is sitting around saying, I've got a problem. I knew you could fix this. Somebody who's a Russian-speaking fighter pilot who also knows a little bit about creativity and storytelling. So because nobody ever thought of me, they liked what I did, and if they were in a workshop or a class with me, they liked that.
Yeah.
But they didn't think of me to help them solve their problem. So it was about just over 2 years ago now that I said, all right, I need to focus on something that's very clear, that is a very clear value. Like, here is exactly when you would work with me and exactly what you're going to get from that. That thing turned out to be, storytelling. And since then, it is so much easier because when people have a problem communicating, when a founder ends a pitch and the first question is, so what do you do? They know, oh, I need to talk to Dan. He's the storytelling guy. He helps me to communicate the thing that I need to communicate. So now that people think of me, they DM me, they send me an email, people refer me, and it's so much easier to have a business that way.
I want to hit the pause button on that.
Yeah.
Dig a little deeper, because what I hear you saying there, that epiphany that you got, is very similar to what you experienced in Kyrgyzstan when you needed to drill down to what is the one thing that I can now finally connect. How can I communicate in a way that will connect, where people get it and go, they'll think of me. That's the first thing that's
really good. Yeah, that's really good. Making that connection. Usually I'm on the other side, asking the questions and making those connections, but that's really good. Thank you.
The second thing I wanted to drill into is your discovery of storytelling. So the way you told it's as if, hey, this isn't working, but here's this one problem. And, it's kind of like the graph that people talk about, the chart to success. It's a straight line. I imagine your case is like everybody else's, and you went through, different iterations till you could finally arrive at, this is it. This is the kernel that I can build my business around. What was that journey? What were some of the things that you tried that didn't work, or that were iterations till you got to the point where you are right now?
Yeah. So when I started out like trying to teach applied creativity, because I had solved or at least made progress on some really big problems inside the Air Force, from deterring the Russians in the Baltics to helping to build the Afghan Air Force. We didn't talk about it, but near the end of my career, I ran the hotline between our headquarters and the Russian headquarters in Syria for a year. Wow. Negotiating with them and making sure we weren't attacking each other or running airplanes into each other, and fighting the ISIS small drone problem. The things that are all over Ukraine right now, they were first really used on a large scale militarily in Syria by ISIS. So what I wanted to do was teach people how to take those things that I had learned, connect them with the psychology and the neuroscience of how we think, and then turn them into very practical things that people could do to lead their own teams.
Yeah.
Before you start solving a problem, you need to make sure you're solving the right one. So we worked on critical thinking, and then you've got to collaborate with people and then communicate with them. So I did like in-person sessions. I have a game that I designed, and I was teaching that game, and I had some contracts set up that fell through after the pandemic happened. So I started teaching on Zoom. And I even had my curriculum was adopted by James Madison University as a certificate program there. But it was really, really hard to get people like into that course, because, ultimately, because all the things that I was teaching are about how to make yourself a little bit better. But the things that people want to buy are things that keep them from losing, that keep them from being worse. So I was essentially, like, over and over, I was trying to sell vitamins to people who needed painkillers. And once I found that was the place and the right way to communicate, it all started to make sense. Along the way, when I was teaching, I would use stories to teach, and I would build stories into what I was teaching because they're incredibly effective at moving ideas. So I got pretty good, at telling stories and understanding how to build them. But it wasn't until later that I said, this is the skill that people need that will take them from losing to winning.
The idea there is Daniel Kahneman's losses loom larger than gains. And that's what you're talking about there, right? Where you found a way, whereas before you were talking about the gains, and people are like, yeah, that's cool. That's great. But when you can point to the pain, the losses, that's where action would occur. And if I'm hearing you correctly, what you experienced when you started introducing this idea of working with founders on building their stories, that was a pain that people could readily recognize. They were already feeling it. You were here with, with the more cowbell, there's the only cure is a story. Yeah. So is
100%.
And how did you come to the discovery to that idea of losses loom larger than gains, the pain versus gain aspect? What was that switch where you go, yes, that works?
So it was actually when I was writing my dissertation for my PhD, I was writing on small state foreign policy decision making. So I did a lot of work in the Baltics as well, and Kyrgyzstan is one of those states. And sometimes those countries will make decisions that are riskier than what we would imagine that they would make.
Right.
So in 2005, Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics for prospect theory. And one of those key principles of that is the one you said, right? That losses hurt more than gains feel good.
Yeah.
And because losses hurt more than gains feel good, people will take more risks, spend more money, go to greater lengths to stop losing than to start winning. So small states, when they are worried about what they are going to lose, they make decisions sometimes that are far riskier than we would imagine in a superpower, which is mostly concerned in what can I gain. But this doesn't just apply to countries. What Kahneman was finding and Tversky was that this worked across cultures and across people. It's incredibly robust. I even repeated some of those experiments and the things that I was teaching to teach this idea, and it works, right? It moves people to losses, move people to stop losing.
Yeah.
And when you're thinking about gaining, that's just an incremental improvement on where you are, and making that connection for people in business stories in particular, especially with customer stories, is it's a real unlock in the way that we talk to our customers and in empathizing with who they are and what is the pain that they have.
Let's build on that. So you tapped into the pain, realized, look, founders, business leaders, and so forth, they understand that they need stories to get their ideas across. What are the types of stories, speaking specifically to founders, that every founder should have in their toolbox that helps them drive sales growth?
No, that's great. I want to take one step back to something you just said, though, right?
Yeah.
So what I didn't discover, or founders, I don't assume that founders know that they need a story to do this thing. What I know is that they have a pain when they are not heard, when they're not understood, when they're not remembered, when people don't trust them. And all they know, that is the pain. And they don't care. They don't care how that pain gets resolved. If I had a pill that made them be understood, they would take the pill.
Don't worry about the story. Take this pill. Yeah.
100%. Right. So this is a place where lots of founders go wrong, right? Because founders are solutions experts. We're experts in the solution that we built. We spend our time, our money, our energy to do it. We're also problem experts. We can see the problem a mile away because it needs the solution over here that I've built. But your customers are not experts, certainly not in solutions. They may not be experts in the problem, but they are experts in the pain that they feel. So when I start talking to my customers, if I start stories around that pain that they feel, now they're like, oh, I need to keep listening to this because this is about exactly me, about exactly the pain that I feel. And now they will listen to me long enough to get over to, here's how I solved that pain, that problem for someone else. Here's the problem that they actually had. Here's how I solved it. And I can do the same thing for you.
Let me hit the pause button real quick.
Let's do it.
And then we'll dive into the types of stories. I want to reinforce what you just said. So the idea that you're talking about there is you start with the pain. The biggest mistake you've probably seen founders make, that I've made and seen other founders and their sales teams make, is they preach their gain, their solution, and the customer does not care at that moment. They are not in a receptive state to hear what you have to say because they're not there. They're not there emotionally. But if you start with the pain and you meet them where they are and you can help them label it and help them make sense of it, you're there with them. Now you can walk alongside them. That's where they become receptive, open, and more than that, there's a sense of urgency that you did not have to, generate under false pretenses. They know they need it and they need it now. Does that accurately capture what you were saying?
Yes. Yeah, 100%. So to use an example from our conversation today, if if I were around when you were teaching your kids how to drive, and I had a business where I taught kids how to drive, the way that I would start talking to you is, I helped out a person. They were a busy professional. They felt this responsibility to train, their kids how to drive because they want them to be safe. They've got to learn how to do it. But honestly, it was driving them nuts. Yeah. They were frazzled the entire time that they were in the car. Their son or daughter over there was angry for hours after they left. It ends up with both of you yelling. They're not comfortable driving. They're not learning what they need to. And you aren't able to go back and do your work because you're done for the rest of the night.
Yeah.
I worked with somebody who, and I would tell the story better because I would tell it in their
Sure.
circumstance, not saying you. And I would say, and then they came to me, they found me, and now we worked out this arrangement. I evaluated the skills that that their kid already had. And I gave them a plan for how we would get there, exactly what they needed to pass, and I guaranteed that they would pass their driver's test, or I would stay with them for as many lessons as it took them to finish. Now, I don't have to tell you, come buy my stuff because
100%.
you were saying, how do I buy your stuff? Because I talked about the pain that you were feeling at that time. And I talked about it with enough precision and detail that you imagine, and you can tell me if this actually happened to you. You imagined yourself sitting in the passenger seat of the car next to your kid, thinking about those times that maybe you lost your temper more than you wanted to.
Yes.
So I just give you the frame that allows you to put your experiences and you fill in all those spaces, right? I give you the frame of the car, but you imagine the car, you imagine what your kid looked like, you imagine that situation, you remember that pain, and now you're looking for, how do I get over that pain? That's the only thing that matters now. How do I relieve it? And if I have the solution for you, now I have to be priced at a place that you can actually afford, but if the price is right, you were going to buy it, because why would you go back to hurting when there's the solution here and you don't have to hurt it?
What you also did there was you drew me in. You didn't come at me to say, here's what our service can do for you. Bullet point 1, bullet point 2, bullet point 3. No, you drew me in to where I can go, I can relate to that guy or woman that Dan had helped. And oh, by the way, the way he helped that person makes sense to me. I'm feeling that same pain that I can relate to. Maybe he can help me too. You did not sell me at that point. You pulled me, you drew me in to where I wanted to pursue what you had to offer. That's what that story did.
Yes, 100%, right? Stories, you build them right, they start dopamine in your brain. Dopamine is a seeking chemical. It's looking for the solution to this thing, or it's looking for food, or it's looking for your keys, whatever those things are. And if I do it right, I start that dopamine flowing. And what I talk about to people in my course and that I'm teaching is, you want the story to pull your audience through it. So you can't push a string, right? You pull a string if you want to move it. I want to pull you through the story so that you're going, that's me. Yeah. Oh, I've got that problem. What? Oh, if he understands the problems so well, maybe he also understands how to solve it. Let me see how he solved it for this other person. All right, well, it seems reasonable. That makes sense in the context of what we are thinking about. When I get to the end, like, the meaning is clear. It's not hypnosis. Like, I can't guarantee that every person's going to buy, but they are going to imagine themselves using your product or service and imagine the outcome that it can create for them. And no matter what you're selling, if you have the person that you're talking to imagining them using your product, like, you're making progress.
Yeah. That's a great example of how a story works. So now let's go into, okay, as a founder, you've got a toolbox, and there are different types of stories that you would use. And so what I'd like for you to do is tell us the types of stories, and then let's break down the differences, but also what may be the universal structure for how to build those stories across the board. So let's talk about the different types of stories in the founder's toolbox.
Yeah, that's good. So I think the way that I would start thinking about it is, who are the audiences that you need to communicate with? So you've got one audience is customers. Right? Every business is a business because they have customers and people give them money, right? But also, every business is a business because someone pays someone else to relieve their pain. So I will tell a story for customers that sometimes it's essentially like your founder origin story, especially for people who maybe are coaches or they're consultants, and they tell the story about how they got to this place, the types of problems, the types of pains that they solved on the way to getting there. Sometimes it will be like, even one of the stories that I wrote for somebody was a tattoo artist that had had a patent on these little mixing sticks to mix up tattoo ink.
Yeah.
And he's trying to sell, his invention to people so they can buy these sticks. So the story that we told there was about how he struggled to mix ink before, that he had toothpicks, or he had these little pixie sticks or coffee stirrers, but it went everywhere, or he had there's a battery powered version, but it sprays ink in other places. But also he was distracted. He wanted his attention to be on his client and the art that he was creating, but he couldn't do that because he was mixing up these inks all the time. So then he looked for a better way, and he goes through like this 6-year process inventing this better way. And now it's available to you as well.
Yeah.
So in this case, it's both sort of the founder origin story about how he went from being a tattoo artist to an inventor, but it's also a story that's communicating to your ideal customer who has that same pain now, about how these mixing sticks could help them. And it's also building trust. This guy's name was D. It's also building trust with D. Like, he's like me, is what you want those, his customers to say. Like, he's a tattoo artist. He gets it. Like, he wants to focus on the art and focus on the client, but he couldn't. And he built this thing that can. That's the type of story that gets into your customer's mind. So that's the founder origin story. There's one other one that is closely aligned with that when we're talking about customers. And essentially, this is what I call like the customer success story.
Okay.
So this is where I'm telling a story where I'm not the one that had the problem, but I'm helping somebody else who did. So I talk about the pain that they felt, very much the way that we just talked about the short driving story. But it's the same thing. What is the pain that this person felt? What was the change? Every story is a story of transformation. Yeah. So what was the change? And in this case, like, I'm the change. My product, my service, me, I was the one who created this change that went from struggling to success, for this client. And now if you want that same, if you want to stop hurting and you want to experience the same success as this person, that's how you do it. And that's essentially the customer success story.
Now, when the founder wants to scale their sales and they start building a team around them to free them up, what are the types of stories that they use either in leading the teams or to inspire their team to also be telling stories? What are some tools in that toolbox that they can use?
So one of those is what I call the vision story. And this is the story that the leader would tell about like what they want to build. Every story at its core is essentially like a before, the change, and the after. Before, things used to be like this, then this thing changed, and now things are like that. For a vision story, the before is right now. Like, right now, we're growing at this decent rate. We're able to reach these customers. We're doing all right. But if we were to implement this new plan or introduce this new product or change the way that we focus or double down on a value of customer service, we want to create some change that the leader thinks is important for the business, and you want to communicate why is that also important to the people that are working here. That's the change that you put at the top of that triangle. And then the after is what you want to create because of that change. How are we making more money? How are we serving more people? How are we delivering something better for the clients that we're looking for? How do we bring more people into this business and have more people, so we move up and we scale our sales and we scale our impact that's there. It's still the same structure as all those other stories, but the change now is what the leader wants to institute that will create all these great things.
So it's not a retelling of what's happened. It's a future state projection of what could happen.
Yeah. So the first question when I work with clients to write their stories, I only have like 2 set questions. And one of them is, what is the action you want people to take after they consume the story? All the stories that I do, I don't write fiction, I write real life stories. And these stories are designed to move people to action. So what do I want them to do? And now I build the story so that at the end of it, my audience, the only logical thing left for them to do is to do this thing. So it's very much tuned to the action, tuned to the audience, and then we use the story structure to get from here to there.
Before we break down the story structure, I want to recap what we've covered so far and make sure I'm on the same page.
Yeah.
So you talked about the founder's origin story in the toolbox. You talked about the customer success story in the toolbox. And I guess another terminology for that that's used in marketing would be like a case study, but you know what you're talking about is something that has a better narrative format, to be candid. And then the third story that you talked about as the founder inspiring their team, as you talked about a vision story. Are there any other specific stories that you would have in that toolbox? Would an elevator pitch be considered a story, or is that a short narrative? How would you define that?
Yeah, good. So when I talk about story, and there's lots of books about brand stories and other stories that are out there. And I'm not the word police, but when I talk about story, I mean the type of story that would be okay to tell around a campfire. That is, it's a complete narrative. It's got a beginning, it's got a middle, it's got an end, it's got a character who has some goal, but that character meets obstacles that prevent them from achieving that goal. And they have to either transform themselves or transform the world to be able to get there.
Yes.
Once I understand like what that story is, and it's not just understanding, it's also finding the story and how it's hiding sometimes in the founder's mind. But once we find that story, now we can tell that story in a variety of different ways depending on who the audience is. But it still comes back to what I call it's like the nano story. It's like from blank to blank, from confusion to clarity, from fear to security, from struggle to success. And now next is what I call like the micro story, which is just the 3 sentences, the before, the change, and the after. So before, I didn't know what to do. I was confused and frustrated. Then I met Sean. He showed me his 10-step process for this thing. After, now I didn't struggle with those things anymore, and I was able to make more money and spend more time with my kids.
Yeah.
Right. So it's still essentially the same story, but it's now told in a shorter way. And if I have to give an elevator pitch, then I'll cut it down to those key sentences there. Or if I'm doing a keynote on stage, or if I have text on my website or my about section, now I can expand it out and do more, but the core is still the same.
So the core is going to be the full story. And then it's from that full story, you go, okay, how do we, how do we package this big piece of candy into, we'll make it Tootsie Rolls or what, finding different ways that you can take the same substance, but you're packaging it in a different way in terms of how you want it to be received by the audience. Is that correct?
It is. Yes, it is. It is packaged in different ways. It is told in a different way that is maybe more relatable, or in a way that has details. I think about for our dogs, we have these collapsible bowls.
Yes.
Right. Because they fold up and they're easy to carry. And if I only pop out like one piece of the bowl, it's still a bowl, but it's thin. It can still hold water, but only a little bit of water. Or I do another step or another step. At each step, it's a bowl. But when I fully expand it, now it's like the biggest bowl that's there. It would do no good for me to have a hole in it where it's not a bowl and it can't be used. Even though I'm collapsing the story and expanding the story, it still is a story that can achieve some end at every level.
That's a fantastic metaphor for that. And what I want to make sure that I'm clear on is, so you've got the founder's origin story, you have the customer success story, you have the vision story. Are those, if I'm hearing you correctly, are those the 3 key stories that you would have in the toolbox, and then you would use different packaging formats, lengths based on those stories and depending on your audience and the situation. Is that
Yes.
my understanding?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the one other one that's like closely aligned to the founder origin story is essentially like the venture origin story, where maybe the founder had already been a founder for a while, but pivoted from this, this product, this service over to this product or service, or maybe they built a tool inside their business and now they are taking that tool to market to sell as a separate SaaS offering or something there. And now that's sort of the venture origin story. How did we start building like this business rather than how did I become a founder and solve this problem? But when you have those 3 or 4 stories, you have the start to conversations.
Yes.
And most importantly, you can quickly get your idea into the person that you're talking to, whether it's one person on a Zoom call or it's a whole group of people on a podcast or it's a filled room at a conference. You get your idea into their mind so they understand like what's he doing. They get the idea, and now once they get it, now you can start playing with that. You can start moving around and telling other stories that illustrate it or multiple customer success stories so that they can get those. But with just those 2, 3, 4 core stories, you have lots of flexibility and you can deploy those in lots of places.
Let's talk about then the structure. You mentioned that there's a common structure. What I've heard before, you tell me if this is the same thing, but what we talked about earlier, you mentioned there are 3 components. The middle one is the change. So you got the before the change or transformation, and then the after, the kind of the inciting incident, if you think of a traditional story arc. And typically what you say is, look, let's start with the change and then, you fill out the before and after. Is that accurate, or walk us through how you would describe what that structure is and how you recommend approaching that structure as you're getting that story out of your head and onto paper and then ultimately into people's, penetrating their minds and hearts.
Yeah, let's do it. So I think we have it set up so I can share an image there. So these are essentially these 7 parts of a story that I talk about all the time, right? Yep. And this is in the picture version. So in every story that I prepare and tell and sort of write out, if I'm going to be prepared to give it to an audience, we'll start with what I call like a preamble. This preamble is just a short couple of sentences that are designed to start the dopamine that we were talking about before, to start pulling the person through the story, and also to let them know that they're about to receive a story, so that their brain sort of switches from absorbing facts to absorbing stories, so that they'll be interpreted in different ways.
Real quick, so would that be considered what would be the hook, and then the prime the audience to set expectations of what's coming after?
It is. Like, most people would call it a hook. Like, I personally don't like the imagery of a hook, because it's a trick that you pull somebody from a place that they want to be to, this fish, now it's out of water and it can't breathe. But 100%, what I want to do, I do have to capture their attention, but I want to quickly convert their attention into interest. So if we go back to if I were writing a story about a car, like a driving teaching service, I might say something like, I worked with a busy professional who could close multi-million-dollar deals, but sitting next to his daughter in the front seat of the car, teaching her to drive, made him sweat till he came to me.
Yep.
And now, if I'm talking to a person who has that pain, they know that this isn't just a straight sales pitch. Like, he's about to tell a story about how somebody who had my pain is going to solve it. And if it's really a pain for them, now their dopamine starts, because their brain has heard that there's a solution in the future, and that dopamine is going to pull them through. They want to hear my next line.
Yeah.
And I've sort of primed them for what's going to happen here. Like, there's going to be success at the end, but we don't know how it's going to get there.
Yeah.
So that preamble, just 2 quick lines that gets them into the story. And now it's the before. I want to set up just the base level of where we are starting. So in a story like that, it might be, his daughter had just turned 16 and she was really looking forward to driving. She'd been talking to all of her friends, and this is something she'd been dreaming about for years. So on her 16th birthday, she got her, or maybe 15th birthday, for her learner's permit. She got her permit and she wanted to learn to drive. And he went out and sat next to her and realized at that moment he was completely unprepared for what he was about to do. Right? That's the before. That sets the baseline.
Let me clarify on this.
Yeah.
So the before would then also be considered the backstory or setting up the context to what's about to come. Clarify that for me.
Yeah. So yes, it is. However, when you talk about backstory or you talk about context, usually people who are inexperienced storytellers put way too much in there. So the whole thing bogs down. You just started out with this quick, like tight 2 lines that said something great's about to happen. And now you're like, all right, sit back, because now we got to go through, it was his first child, and she grew up and he was a great father to her, and she always looked up to her father. All these things that are important to that guy and important to that daughter, but they're not important to this story, and they're not important to your customer or the audience that you're trying to get to. So you've got to rip all of that out, and I'll tell you in just a second how I make sure that I make that as easy as possible.
That's a fantastic point. So by using the word before, you're having the founder focus on, okay, just as succinctly as you can say, what was going on before. We don't need your full backstory at that point.
Right.
Love it.
So
okay.
I think about these stories pretty much, and I usually aim for like a 3-minute story is what we create. Mm-hmm. And a 3-minute story is essentially like one scene out of a person's life. There still has to be this story arc, a before, a change, and an after in each one of those, but I don't have to tell you everything about me for you to be able to make the meaning that I want you to make at the end of this short story.
Yeah.
So I only need to give you enough for you to, and this is true for every piece of the story, I only give you enough for you to be able to make the meaning that I intend.
Excellent. Okay.
So we lay the groundwork with that before, and now we go into the challenges. Like this is the pain, and this is where you need to understand the pain that your customer feels. This is a sales story, for instance. What is the pain that they are feeling? Not what is the problem that they have, but what is the pain that they are feeling? They are pain experts. And when I talk about the pain that they are feeling, I talk about how as soon as she started moving, he could feel his hands tightening on the armrest. He was leaning way over to get his hand on the wheel if he needed to. When he needed to tell her to stop, instead of just saying stop, he shouted right away. He could tell that she was getting angry, and he could see her eyes starting to get moist and tears about to go, and he felt horrible.
Yeah.
This is something that she's been wanting to do, and he is not teaching her in a way to make her safe, and 2, it is hurting their relationship, and he didn't want to go driving with her the next time. If I can understand that much about my customer, and you hear that, and that's how you feel at every step, you're saying, yep, that's me. Yeah, that's me. I felt exactly the same way. Or currently, I feel exactly the same way. Each time, that dopamine continues to build, because I'm saying there's some solution. I've already told you, I'm going to tell you how I solved it. And that dopamine builds and builds and builds. And what we want to do in this section of challenges is the guy pushing the rock, up the hill. I want to continue building up that tension until something has to happen. Either he's like, that's it, I'm not teaching you to drive anymore, and she never drives again. Or he finds some solution, right? And that's what we're doing all along this challenges. This is what makes the story like actually work to sell or to move people to action. This is where we build in all the stuff we're talking about, prospect theory and losses, here in the challenges, because we're talking about all those things that you are losing right now. And the overall message is you don't have to keep losing, because I have what's going to help you, and that's here at the change.
Yeah.
And in this case, like my service or me, I'm the peak of this triangle. I am the change. They came to me. We worked out a plan. I did all of that with them. The daughter was able to drive. And honestly, I've taught hundreds of people how to drive. The dad had only taught one person or none. So she's a better driver because of it. She's more safe, and they are able to maintain, they come to me and we work it out. And now the resolution is all those things that we unwind. Now she has her license. She's a safe driver. She doesn't have to worry about her father yelling at her for bad driving. And she passed her test on the first try.
Yeah.
The meaning is for people who are struggling to teach their kids how to drive, and they feel like they're not equipped to do it and it's ruining their relationship, I'm a perfect option for them to do it. And it only costs $85 a lesson or whatever the right price is there.
When you're working with somebody in brainstorming the components that they'll draw from to build that story, where do they start? Where do you have them start to get that process rolling?
Yeah. So if I'm working with the client to build the story, I don't put I don't want them to try to tell me what the story is, because I'm looking for the right components. I'm looking for the right moment of change. And the right moment of change is the hardest part of sort of finding that core of the story. Typically with clients, I'll do a 1-hour session for us to find all those pieces that I need. And I will often take 45 minutes just looking for the right moment of change. Now I'm picking up other elements sort of along the way that eventually I'll build back in, but it takes a long time sometimes to find what is the change that actually took you from struggling to success, and making sure that change is also available to your audience. Yeah. It doesn't do any good for me to have a change and then this genie appeared, gave me 3 wishes, problem solved, and the genie left. Because now my customer's like, well, I just have to get a genie to fix it. It doesn't do any good if the solution isn't available to the audience. So I want to make sure that the moment of change is something that my audience can do as well. Typically it'll be through me and my product and my service to get them there. And then after I get all those pieces, where I start actually writing the story is at the moment of change. Now I'll tell it in the way I showed you, from the preamble, before, change, and after. But when I start writing it, I start writing at the moment of change for 2 reasons. One is, if I don't have a good moment of change, I'm not going to have a good story.
Nothing else. Yeah.
So it forces me to get that right first. And then usually I'll write that moment of change and I'm just going to roll, and I write all the way to the end. And now I go back and I write the before and the challenges. And what this helps me do is make sure that I don't put in a bunch of stuff that I should edit out later, because I already know the change is going to happen, how the story ends. The stuff that I need to include are only those things that either led to the change or that were changed. And instead of me putting in this huge backstory, I know that they don't need to know that it was, that she was born in a hospital at night. She just needs to know that, oh, she's 15 now and she wants to learn how to drive. That's good enough. And it keeps me from having to go back and edit out all those things. And then at the very end, I create that opening line, that preamble. It's the more artistic part of building the story. And it is often the hardest to create. So I do that at the very end, and then you have a full story.
Yeah, that's going to the top of that story there. That is what copywriters wrestle with when they're writing a headline and, or a hook or preamble, as you put it. Oftentimes that's where a lot of your time could be spent making sure that's just right. Because if you don't have your audience's attention, they're not going to consume the rest of it.
Yes. And the way that you get their attention, but it's not just a game of attention. If you fight only for attention, you will lose. My phone right now can buzz, and my attention is going to be pulled towards it. Is it my son? Is it my wife? Is it something that's happening? Yeah. But what brings me back to you is my interest in you and in what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So I have to capture their attention, but quickly convert that attention into interest. Interest is their dopamine. Interest is the pain that they already have. Interest is something that they are already interested in, and now they attach my story to that thing, and that's what's going to pull them through so they can get to the meaning, and they actually hear me, and they hear how I can improve, take away their pain and improve their life.
As we begin wrapping it up here, I've got a couple more questions I'm curious about. The first one is, When you talk about how when you're talking with the client and you're searching for that moment of change, that's going to be the crux of the story. How do you know when you've hit upon it? Is it this gut feel where you go, yes, that's it? Or is there a criteria that goes through your head and you go, these 3, 4 potential moments of change, this one checks all the boxes? What is that signal that you've hit on something?
So, one is being clear on that nano story, right? From struggle to success. If that's the one that we happen to be doing, right? If we're doing a story about from struggling to success.
Yeah.
And I'm looking for literally the moment when that change occurred. Matthew Dix in his book Storyworthy talks about a 5 to 7 second moment of change. I try to drive in as close. If I can get the snap moment, like that's perfect, because it makes the change very clear and very distinct for your audience. It gives them the thing to look out for. And I'm driving in as tight as I can. If it is something where it's a slow change, like I'm writing about how I learned Russian and when I became a Russian speaker, like that didn't happen on one day. There wasn't a snap. But what I do is I find one event where I knew that, all right, I'm a decent Russian speaker, where it sort of serves as like the culmination. When I was talking to customs, for instance, on my first trip, into Kyrgyzstan without an interpreter. But you have to drive to that precise moment. Don't take, oh, I decided to, or eventually, or I realized, like keep getting closer. Why was the day that you quit your job? Why did you not quit the day before? Like you hated your job the day before. Why was it that Thursday? That was enough. That's the question that I want to get to. And when I get there and I keep pushing and keep pushing and keep pushing, like the one clear sign that that's it is that in some stories, if they're very personal, especially like a founder origin story type thing, if they're very personal to them, we dig. And then when we hit truth, like we both get tears because it's just so clear that like that was it. That was what worked.
That is the value, and speaking to the audience right now, that is the value of having someone like Dan to be able to be outside observer to help draw some of these things out, because all of us can get stuck in our own heads and not see that moment that could actually, light up a story. And so that is a precise reason, precise example of why it's so helpful to have someone like you to be able to draw those stories out of us. Now, where can people find you, Dan?
So the best place is always on LinkedIn. I post tons of content there about very practical things that you can use to build stories. And then also on my website at buildthestory.com. You have my offerings are there. I've got a video of clients the first time that they hear their story and sort of their initial reactions. But LinkedIn's a place where I'm literally every day.
Awesome. Well, Dan, thank you so much for investing your time with us. Really, really appreciate you today.
Thanks so much. Really great questions. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us. If you liked what you heard, please hit like and subscribe and share this episode with anyone you think will find value in it. In the meantime, I'll leave you with this. Always remember, when you fix your systems, you'll fix your sales. Until next time.